Hello and welcome to REDCap Data Management, Security, and Randomization. Steve here. And so in this class we're going to be starting just by setting up our project, and then we're going to take a look at some branching, piping, and smart variables, and some of the metadata that we include on top of our forms. Before we begin, I just want to point out that we're using REDCap version 8.5.0 here. So if you're using a different version than that, things might look slightly different, but the general principles should still apply. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we're just logged into the REDCap main home screen here, and we're going to need to set up a new project. So to do that, we'll go up to the New Project tab, and we can give this project a title of REDCap Data Management. And I'm just going to put the date in to keep myself organized. What day is it? The 11th. We can mark this project as just for fun, because it's just a test project. I'm not going to assign it to a folder or give it a note, but what we want to do here, instead of creating an empty project, we want to use a template. And if you scroll down to the bottom, we can choose REDCap Data Management Course. And then we'll say Create Project. Okay, so this takes us to kind of our main project setup screen. And the next thing we're going to want to do is import some data, because we're going to be running a few queries here and we'll need some data for that. So to do that, we can open up a new tab, and we're going to go to http://bit.ly/2gl capital N capital U 24. And if you type that in correctly, you should have something that looks not unlike this. Just one note, if you're using Internet Explorer, sometimes this little table doesn't render out properly. But don't worry about that, as long as you just click the download button. And it will download to whatever the default folder is, probably. Most likely your downloads folder. So we can close this tab, and then we'll go back into REDCap and go to the Data Import tool. And we'll scroll down to the bottom and choose the Choose File button. And I've already saved mine to the desktop here, so I'll just select the file, say Open, and then I will upload the file. And you'll probably get some warnings here saying that you can't import values into calculated fields, and that's fine, because these values will just recalculate, so it's not a big deal. So yeah, you can go through and you'll see all of the data that's being imported, and if you're happy with that, you can click the Import Data button. Okay, and if everything goes according to plan, you'll get this little import successful notification here. So that's it for project setup, which means we can now get into the actual class. So let's go up to project setup here, and then we'll go into the online designer, and then let's click on the example demographics link here, and this will be our example demographics form. So before we actually do anything here, I just want to point out a few things on this form, specifically these fields along the top. So you'll notice that first we have a references and notes box, and the note here is just this example form was created by Steve Hawley with my email address for the REDCap data management class. And so the idea here, along with all of these fields up until you see this demographics heading, is that we want to collect some metadata about these forms, and I'll explain each of these fields in turn, but these fields have kind of evolved over my time working with REDCap to try to capture kind of all of the important metadata about collecting data in REDCap. So I started including this references and notes box a couple of years ago, because we found that we were sharing a lot of assessments or a lot of forms in between projects, and oftentimes when we were sharing forms in between projects, people would make maybe little tweaks to the data entry forms for their own respective projects, and you kind of get this drift of the assessment over time, and it would get further and further away from the actual real assessment. So the idea here is that whoever creates the form would put in whoever created it, so their name, their email address, and let's see, maybe one of these other ones would be a better example. Okay, so here's an example. This assessment was created by a different group, so the ARC at St. Mike's, for the SPIN study. So I always put in what study it was originally created for. And then the idea here is to put in like an academic reference or maybe a commercial reference, basically some kind of reference that you use to create the form. So in our demographics form, it was fine because we kind of just created that ourselves. But if you have an actual assessment, you want to put that reference in, because those will be important to know for anybody who's using it, maybe what the version is, or if they need to go back to the paper to check something. It's a really handy thing to have. So let's go back to our demographics form. Right, and the other thing I should point out too is that if you do make any sort of custom changes to the form for your specific study, you should note that in this references and notes box, because that's going to be really important for anybody who uses the form after you. Okay, oops, get rid of that. So the next thing here is we have a notes box, and the point of this box is, the way I like to think of it is kind of just like the top of a piece of paper. So if you were sitting with a participant and, you know, something that you weren't expecting happened, and then they spilled their coffee on your computer or something like that, and you just need a place to put a note. I always just leave this empty notes box up here for somebody to write something, just anything that like could have gone wrong that wouldn't normally be captured during the assessment. And I find that people actually make a lot of use of this box, so it's a handy one to have. So the next set of forms here, or sorry, the next set of fields here is, first we ask, was this form complete? So we have yes and no, which is fairly obvious. If they say no, we bring up a list of reasons here why the participant didn't complete the form. If they say yes, then we use branching logic to show all of these fields to bring the form up. And the third option here for partial, this is something I just started doing sort of recently, because we were finding during our data quality checks that sometimes forms would be sort of half complete, or maybe they'd be missing a question or two, and we had no way of knowing if that was intentional or if half the data got erased, or really what happened. So the idea with the partial button here would be the data entry person would select it, let's say if the participant wanted to stop halfway through, and then they couldn't collect the rest of the data. And in that case, if partial is selected, we use branching logic to bring up this field here that says, please enter a note why the data are incomplete. And this is a great opportunity to use the notes box and say something like, I don't know, the participant did not want to complete the rest of the assessment. Because that way, when we're doing our data quality checks, we'll immediately know what's going on. So the next set of fields here I think are pretty self-explanatory. We have participant initials as like a prompt to remind the data entry person who they're entering data for. We have the rater initials because we want to know who actually conducted the assessment. This is a result of sometimes we found that some of our raters were doing an assessment one way and other raters were doing it another way. So we needed to have a way to go back to see who was doing what form to make any changes. Similarly, the same idea with REDCap data entry personnel. It's always good to know who the person was who actually entered the data. If maybe we find that they were doing something incorrectly, we want to be able to fix that. We have date of assessment and date of data entry, which I think are pretty self-explanatory. And then we have this branching logic field here just to remind the user that obviously the data entry date must be after the date of assessment because it wouldn't make sense otherwise. And so what I mentioned earlier is that you'll notice on a bunch of these forms, or sorry, fields, is that particularly after we get into the actual data demographics form here, is that all of these fields are set to reveal only if the form is marked complete or partially complete. And this will just help us during our data quality checks later on. And we'll talk about that in another video. So the idea here is when I'm designing a new form in REDCap, I basically just start by copying and pasting this set of metadata fields. And I put this set of fields really on top of all of my data collection instruments. And especially for if you're creating assessments for a study. And it's important to have all of these because, you know, every one of these fields I've had to use to go back to try to fix something in the data or, you know, help people with their data entry. And it's kind of just good practice to start doing things this way. Okay, so, right, and then the other thing to point out is that now that you have this template project from this class, you can go into the data dictionary for this project, this REDCap project, and just copy and paste these fields into whatever new forms you create, and then just change the variable names, obviously, for your project. So you don't have to worry about reprogramming all of these from scratch. So that'll be useful. Okay, so that aside, let's move into the actual demographics form. And actually, sorry, we're not even going to do that. We're going to stay in the metadata fields here. And we're going to add one of our own, one right here by participant initials. And what we're going to add is a little warning field to prompt the data entry person if they enter participant initials that don't match the original initials from the beginning of the forms. So I'll just point out before we do that, in this record ID form, or our first form here, we have two fields, the mandatory record ID field, and then we have a second field here of record initials. And so this would be kind of like the point of truth, or like the official record initials field here, because we're going to be comparing all of our other forms to this one. And you'll notice, well, it's gone now, but the variable name was record ini, and that's what we're going to be using. So we'll go back down to participant initials here, and we're going to add a new field, and we'll just add a descriptive text field. And we're going to use a little bit of HTML styling here just to make things jump out a bit. So we'll start by putting in a few line breaks. And then, what do we have here? We can center it. And then we'll say something like participant initials have not been entered correctly. Please ensure that you are entering data for... And then this is where the magic of piping comes in. But first, actually, we'll use the magic of HTML to make the initials red. So we'll say font color equals red. And just a few points here, you want to make sure that you're using the American spelling, and then you have equals and then red in quotation marks. And so to use piping, all we're going to be doing is just putting the variable name that we're interested in square brackets. So in this case, we want to bring in record initials from that first form. And if you'll recall, the variable name from that field was record underscore ini for initials. Close that in square brackets. And then we'll just close off some of these HTML tags. So we'll close the font color and then the center. And then for good measure, we'll put in a couple more line breaks just to make this even more big and obnoxious. And we'll give this a variable name. So in this case, we'll call it demo for demographics underscore ini, and then I'll just say warn. And if we save that, it should look somewhat like this. And you'll see in this case we just have record ini as the variable name here. But let's see how this looks. Oh, sorry, and before we even do that, we want to use branching logic to only make this show if the participant initials have not been entered correctly. So the workflow kind of that we're going for here is that the data entry person is entering the data, the metadata at the top, they enter in the participant initials here, and we want the initials here to match what are in that record ID form. And if they don't match, we want to pop up this little warning here that's going to show them the correct initials that they should be entering. So we've completed that part with the piping, but now we need to use branching logic to make this show up properly. So to enter the branching logic, we'll click the little branching logic icon here. And the branching logic that we're going for is, first we want to check that there is actually something entered in the participant initials field. So we'll say demo underscore sub ini, pops up here, which is nice. So we'll say does not equal blank. And we want to make sure, or we want to check that demo sub ini does not equal record ini. And yeah, so just to be clear, the idea here is that we're checking first that something has actually been entered into the participant initials field right here. And then we're checking that it doesn't actually match the record initials that were entered in that first form. So we'll save that, and let's see how this looks. So we'll go to the record status dashboard. and we'll go to just the example demographics here for record 1. Okay, so we have, well, first of all, I'll just show on record ID that our participant initials here are JHAL. And if we go into demographics, we can see that's what's been entered, so that's good. But let's try entering something different. I'll just put my own initials in. Oh, for some reason, I always have trouble with this, but I put my own initials in, and you'll see as soon as I do that, we get this flag here that says participant initials have not been entered correctly. You are entering the data for JHAL. So this is a nice little warning to let the data entry person know that they're about to put data in that doesn't belong to JHAL here. And you'd be surprised, this does happen sometimes. And while it's not impossible to fix in REDCap, it is a bit of a pain because you have to export the data and then clean it up and then re-import it. There's really kind of no easy way to move data from one record to another. So I always try to make every effort to put these types of warning ins for the data entry people so we can kind of just avoid these errors at the outset. You'll see that as soon as I put JHAL back in, the warning disappears. Okay, so that's it for piping. Let's go back to modify instrument up here. I'll just leave because I don't need to save the data. Because next we're going to look at smart variables. And smart variables are similar to piping in the sense that you're going to be using kind of square brackets to call certain things. But whereas piping allows you to call data that's been entered already, smart variables are going to let you call kind of other things about the project that are not always easily accessible. And I will point out that smart variables only became available in version, I want to say, it was definitely 8 point something. It might have even been 8.5. So it's a relatively newish feature of REDCap, so you might not be as familiar with it. So I'm just going to go to the top of the form here, and maybe I'll go right under this section header. I'll add a field and just a descriptive text again. And I just want to point out that we have 2 buttons here that are going to show us how to use both piping and smart variables. And actually, just while we're here, I'll show you the piping button. And there's a really big and thorough explanation for how to use piping, including piping checkboxes, which is kind of a new feature. I think it was also introduced after version 8. And it was something that was surprisingly difficult to do before. So you might want to go through and have a look at this, because it can be a pretty handy feature to have. But yeah, so we have our help file for piping, and then we have our help file for smart variables. And again, there's a kind of a giant wall of text here that tells you everything you need to know about smart variables. And then we have a list of all of the available smart variables for you to use. And a lot of these can be, I don't want to say complicated, but they're definitely very specific in where you would use them, particularly for repeating instruments and events, which I think, in my opinion at least, I'm pretty sure smart variables were created to deal with this issue of repeating instruments and events. Just in terms of how you reference, like the previous instance or the current instance. But that's not so much applicable in our case today, nor are these ones for events and arms. What I will point out is that if you are creating a longitudinal project with multiple arms and events, and you do need to do branching logic or calculations, sometimes you might find yourself stuck when you're trying to call certain variables. And in that case, you might want to turn to smart variables because at least I've found that they've been able to solve a few problems for me. So mostly I just want to make you aware of what's here so that if you do get stuck, you can come into this help file and read through this documentation here. But for our purposes, we're just going to stick with something very simple. We're just going to use the top one here, that's username. And so I'll close this because this is just a help file. In our field label here, I'm just going to do hello, and then I'm going to use the smart variable of user name. And you'll know it's a smart variable because it uses a dash, whereas almost in all other cases in REDCap, you're going to be seeing underscores. So this is kind of like a tip-off that you're using a smart variable. We'll give this a variable name. We can just call this demo, maybe underscore hello, and we'll say save. And there's nothing too fancy here, but if we were to go to see how this actually looks, we can go back to the record status dashboard and go to example demographics. And where is it? Oh, here we are. So you'll see now that it picks up the name of the current user. So in this case, my account is Workshop 11. Really, that's all there is to it. So I'm not sure when you would need to use this, but the option is available. And like I said, smart variables are most useful in cases where you're using repeated forms or in events, or if you're using longitudinal projects. Okay, so I think that does it for part 1 of this series. In the next part, we're going to look at creating some custom reports. So I'll see you there.